Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I see we have a good turnout. Thank you, everyone, for joining CUTA's webinar on microtransit and how to reimagine mobility in your community. This is our second in our learning series that we have for you. So I'm really excited for this session on microtransit. I think this is obviously an emerging topic, something that a lot of people are looking at. But we know it's a topic that can be hard to know how to tackle, know what questions are the right questions to ask, understand, how do we implement this? How do we approach this? Where do we consider that might be a good use for this tool as it becomes, an ever increasing different tool in our mobility toolbox that it constantly keeps expanding, which is really exciting in the transportation industry. So I'm really excited. We have a couple of speakers that are right on the forefront of this issue, which are Arjan van Andel, who is head of transit partnerships at Uber. And we also have Jim McDonald, who's director of Saskatoon Transit. So I think this will be a great topic for everyone to be able to learn about how to maybe start thinking about microtransit. What's the ideal situation for where it can be implemented? What are the methods to run it and operate it? Those different things. So I'm really excited to discuss this with everyone. The way it will work is I'll have our two speakers give a bit of a presentation, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So at any time, feel free to enter your questions. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I think it will likely be at the bottom of the screen. Sometimes it's in different places with Zoom. And then you can ask your questions through there, and we'll be compiling them. And after everyone's done their presentations, we'll do a Q&A with your questions. So keep the questions coming as we go forward. I'm happy to facilitate. And without further ado, then I think we can likely get started. So I'll ask Arjan to share his presentation. And there we see Arjan.
Yes, hopefully.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me on. Just checking if you can hear me. That's the first check.
We can.
Awesome, thank you. And then I will share my screen and I'll check with you if you can also see the screen there.
It's good.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Simon, for organizing this, and thank you, CUTA, for organizing this interactive session. Super excited to participate in this in an interactive discussion. My name, as mentioned, is Arjan van Andel. I work on the transit partnership team for Uber Transit. I'm focusing mainly on Canada. Also, in my free time, I'm the chair of the Anne Arundel County Transportation Commission, so I see the transportation a little bit from the other side, and also that was the former chair of the ITE Transit Standing Committee. I've been working in transit for the last 7 years, focusing on mobility on demand, mostly focusing on operations, scheduling, and simulation. And today I will just give you some general impressions and questions that you can ask for setting up your on-demand service. And of course, try to be as independent as possible so that you can apply those questions and experiences to any type of service that you would like to set up. And of course, also any type of provider that you would like to work with. So to start off for on-demand, planning for on-demand, I think an important question there is just, why are you providing the on-demand service? Because there's a lot of question about like putting in place microtransit on-demand services, but I think knowing why you're going to do this is very important, because it is not the answer to all of your questions, and you want to make sure that you're going to get what you want. So for example, think about, do you set the service up to reduce the wait times or reduce travel times, to reduce customer experience, maybe to ensure that more people will get access to your services? Do you want to decrease the cost per passenger trip for your overall system by possibly replacing some bus routes that are not productive? Or do you want to increase the coverage area in your service hours so that people can go to their critical jobs 24/7? Or do you want to learn just through innovative projects? Or do you want to identify what partnerships are all available with private partners? So there's a lot of different things that you can look at. And these are just a few things that are probably helpful to identify for yourself. Why am I doing this? Before you start engaging in a lot of practical efforts already. And following that, I just wanted to make a point here, and this comes from a presentation from my past, in saying like, there is basically a sweet spot for any type of service. So what this slide is basically showing, like that, for example, if you have a certain cost for your services that you're providing, a bus costs more per vehicle revenue hour than a DRT, and that costs more than TNC. A rail is even more expensive. But if you want to have a certain cost per trip, let's say $2.50, and you want people to not wait more than 7.5 minutes, you can see that every type of service has its sweet spot. And the question, of course, when you start designing your services and looking at your urban design, is like, what is the sweet spot that I would want to serve with the services that I'm designing? So that is, I think, important to know, like that there is a place for on-demand and microtransit, and there is a place for bus, but make sure that you understand what the demand numbers are to see like, hey, what service am I going to put in place once I start thinking about microtransit? Just a few factors to highlight about what is important if you start looking at on-demand service areas. So for example, on the left, I highlighted the service area. For example, if you have a very small and dense area like Toronto, you will see that on-demand service might not be as efficient as when you have like a larger area that is lower density. But if the area gets too large, again, it's very difficult to provide like on-demand services that are cost efficient. Of course, it's important for your service area analysis if there's a core network available to know, like, do I link my on-demand services to this core network so that I can keep my on-demand trips short, because on-demand trips are typically more expensive than any type of bus or rail service. Of course, what you need to understand when you start looking at your on-demand service as well is like the demand. So what types of users are you trying to serve? Are those critical workers? Are those commuters? Is it tourists? Is it a combination of all? Are those college students? They all have different travel profiles, and they travel probably at different times. It is very helpful to understand, like, do I have like an even capacity needed, or do I have a very high peak in the morning, a very high peak in the afternoon, but maybe very low demand in the off-peak hours? That will definitely determine what type of service solution you would like to put in place. Because if you have high peaks and also very low areas of demands, you might want to be more flexible in the fleet that you're putting in place. Of course, one of the items also that I would like to highlight is the mode share. For example, if you're in an area where at this time 95% of the people are using a car, it's a completely different solution that you might want to offer as where only 30% of the people are using their car. Because I think the goal with many of the microtransit projects is to make sure that people that are using their car have an alternative and can let that car stand at the home in the driveway and be able to use the transit services to go to where they would want to go. And lastly, on this slide, the travel profiles. So what I mean with this is, if you look at your service area, you have different types of travel profiles, as I call them. And I know one, for example, that I mentioned on the top is 1-to-1. That basically means like you have one transit hub, and maybe you have one place where there's a large employer, and all the people that arrive at the transit hub and go to the large employer. That's completely different from a demand profile where you have, let's say, many to many. That's like people live all over the service area, and they move all over the service area. For this, it is a lot more complex to set up a service that meets the demand for everybody, but understanding where the people are going to and from and how dispersed that demand is very important in designing your service and choosing the right type of vehicles, for example. And with that, we come to the next one. For example, what are those types of factors that influence your quality of service, for that matter, right? And what we see in defining that on-demand service is, what is very important is, at what times of day do you want to provide your service? Do you just want to provide it at the peak hours? Do you want to provide it from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.? Do you want to provide it 24/7? It provides you with different options by setting those service hours differently. Again, your service area, do you have a big service area, a small service area? Do you connect to your core network, or do you make your entire municipality on demand? It gives completely different solutions and outcomes. And lastly, of course, not to underestimate is the fare structure. What we've seen is with on-demand, if rides to the transit hubs are free or cheap, people will probably be more incentivized to go to the transit stop and make that extra connection. rather than paying like a higher fare and needing to pay another fare, for example, for the core services. Another point for consideration is, of course, your fleet. Your number of vehicles, how many can you deploy? Are you talking about 1, about 2, about 10? If you have 1, you have to make sure that if you understand that you start small, as soon as the vehicle is on one end of the service area and it moves to the other, as soon as there is another person that is in the service area requesting a trip, he definitely has to wait for the vehicle to first drop off the one person and come back. So it definitely impacts the wait times on your service. Size of your vehicle, of course, is important, and possibly like a mixed fleet. Do you have like accessible vehicles, non-accessible vehicles? Are you making a mix between taxi, sedan, TNC, and possibly accessible vehicles? All those factors impact your services for an on-demand or microtransit service. And of course, what is very important as well is like the inconvenience that you allow for your riders. For example, is the maximum wait time 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? Do you let people wait maximum 30 minutes? It makes a big impact on your service design. Another factor that makes a big difference is, like we call it, the travel with transit versus the car travel ratio. For example, if a car trip takes 5 minutes and a transit trip 10, you have a ratio of 10. So, sorry, a ratio of 2. So is it acceptable that the trip with the transit and the on-demand is 2 times as long as a car trip, or do you want to be more competitive? Same with the detour time. Instead of a factor, you can say like, I want a trip never to be longer than 10 minutes or 15 minutes longer than a direct car trip. But being competitive with on-demand services is very important to make it successful. Another important thing is, once you go operate on-demand, do you allow the on-demand vehicle to turn around and pick up a person who just booked the trip when the vehicle passed a minute ago? That might lead to extra complaints from people that are saying, hey, the bus just suddenly made a U-turn and picked up the person that was just behind me. But it might result in high efficiency gain. But those things are things that you would want to consider if you start setting up your on-demand services. Then lastly, just to give you all a rough guideline about like, hey, from experience, what makes sense to operate at what type of day or what type of location is, for example, as you can see, I made a comparison. Sorry about that. I made a comparison between fixed route service, microtransit, but also non-dedicated fleet. Because we see already, for example, at places like YRT, but also in the Montreal region, that there is a mixed use of microtransit and non-dedicated fleet in the form of taxi, and making sure that certain trips are being met when microtransit can't fulfill those trips. And what you see, for example, is that fixed route, as most people know, works very well at volumes of more than 20 people per hour. Microtransit works probably at best when you have 10 to 20 passengers per vehicle hour. But when you get below that 10 people per vehicle hour, a non-dedicated fleet option might be just as cost efficient, because you don't pay for the vehicle hours, but you just pay for the individual trip. Of course, what is important is that you see with the fixed route, people typically wait like 20 minutes max if you want to make it attractive. Microtransit 15 minutes, non-dedicated between 5 and 15 minutes. Typical use cases is highlighted here. You can see like the fixed route service for sure, and the high density services, microtransit, first, last mile, but also accessible services and connecting to the conventional services, where the non-dedicated fleets typically operate at the lower demand density areas and also serve for the first, last mile. Some other areas, of course, I highlighted, like what does it do to your service area? Of course, when you have a fixed route bus, the service area is larger than you operate with non-dedicated fleet. And you see that the subsidies per vehicle trip can highly vary. Typical fixed route service is, of course, the most competitive because you have a lot of people in the same vehicle. Microtransit, it can vary a lot. It depends a lot on your productivity. If you have like many people per hour, your costs go down. But if you have a microtransit vehicle driving around for 1 hour and only one person uses it, it basically costs you $50 to $80 a person. So in that case, it sometimes makes sense to have like a non-dedicated fleet option as a complement and pay between $15 and $20 for a trip for the exceptional cases. Of course, there is also an overview that I gave on the operating cost and the service hours. Depending on what you want, you can choose for the best possible model. Some examples, of course, the fixed route service, everyone on the call, I'm sure familiar with this. Microtransit is being implemented at many places across Canada and in the US by many different types of providers. And the non-dedicated fleet option is also something that we as Uber, of course, work a lot on together with transit partners. One example is, for example, the city of Innisfil. but there's also transportation providers such as Dallas and Denver who just use the non-dedicated fleet as additional options next to the microtransit to make sure that they can cover their riders for 24/7. So these are just a few guidelines and ideas that maybe can serve you as an additional starting point for what service you would like to put in place. Lastly, the conclusions here. Define the goals and objectives before finding the answer, and understand demand from a spatial time, but also from a user point of view. I mentioned also, don't forget the marketing and the outreach, because when you have this fantastic program in place, but nobody knows about it, it's of course not going to be successful. Understand the options that you have for your supply, because there's a lot of options out there. So make sure that you do good research and evaluate what the best options for you are. And of course, try it out. You will see, and you will learn a lot by just starting small at places. And many of those projects can be started with minimum risk and pretty quickly be implemented. And of course, lastly, but not least, is measure the impact and make sure that you keep improving, because the data that you gather is very valuable to design your next generation of your transit service. So with that, I would like to thank you all for this opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion and the questions, of course, in a few minutes from now after the presentation from Jim. So thank you, Simon, and I will turn the screen off right now and look forward to participating in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjan. I really like what you said about setting goals and having objectives from the outset, because I think that with microtransit, it can be a bit of a harder thing to do, right? Is like, you know, it's not necessarily all about ridership, although that can be very important. Maybe that is a goal, but there could be other goals as well. So yeah, thank you for that. I will welcome now Jim McDonald, Director of Saskatoon Transit. Jim, if you want to come online.
Yep, and good afternoon, and just have to do a couple of permissions things that I didn't think I had to on my computer to allow PowerPoint to be shared. So let's see if I can get this to work. Hang on, there we go.
No problem. These things happen sometimes. There you go.
So thank you for the opportunity, CUTA. Thank you for Arjan and for a great intro. Simon and Oliver for the great work you've been doing with us. So from my perspective, I'll be going through some of this is what we learned as we started doing our own experience with microtransit in Saskatoon. So one of the things that we were fortunate was we'd been kicking the tires trying to figure out what it would be, what on-demand transit would look like, whether we could use existing software that we had, or whether we were going to be using some of the things that were on the market, like the Belleville experience. What we ended up doing is we ended up going through a process with Innovate Saskatchewan, which was looking at smaller app companies to deal with. And they ran a competition that both the city of Saskatoon and the city of Regina were engaged in, where we had different app developers that brought forth their pitches. We had one pitch from a transit-related company. We had two from car share or mobility rides companies, and we had one from a way of using your map systems better. The one that we ended up going with was an on-demand transit experience, and it is the vendor Pantonium. And the beauty of this was that the Innovate Saskatchewan and opened the door, got this in there. We could do it as a pilot project, which sort of worked with the new procurement regulations that we had. And even the better part of it was that almost all of the cost at the start and later renegotiated down to half was borne by our city IT department. So we ended up being able to go through this activity, this getting ready for things at very little cost to us. So that was a huge bonus for us. And we really do enjoy the fact that that ended up happening. And my notes have gone because I'm from home, and my connection to my office computer has just crashed on me for some reason. So I'll wing it a bit. So that's the sort of thing that we ended up doing with how we got into this. Some of the things that we looked at when we were here is and why a pilot is absolutely beneficial for you. When you don't understand the concept of what you're talking about, like when you're actually in the moment and you're talking concepts and you're talking with a vendor and you're going back and forth with Brockville or, Belleville and their experience, you get a really good idea, but you don't understand what the nuts and bolts are. So what we were looking for, and we're doing the same sort of thing with the electronic bus, is how does the system actually work on the ground? What assets will you need? What do you want to do? Who is responsible for it? How are they going to use it? How do you talk to your public? What are their expectations? What are you going to have to do? Where's the smoking gun? Where's the cigarette man, if you used to watch the X-Files? How do the public receive it? How do our own staff receive it? Is this a great big black box that nobody understands and they're against? Is it something that they've got an idea about what it is, but they don't understand it? And how useful is this going to be once you actually have it in your lines and you're using it? And a lot of the KPIs and a lot of the use questions that Arjan had in his presentation absolutely fit. What mode are you trying to sort out? What kind of activity do you want to do? How are you going to use this? A lot of people are using it kind of like a gap filler. Regina chose to do late night service, i.e. this would be the way they would reintroduce a dial-a-bus kind of service at night. Saskatoon chose to look at it from the perspective of, we'll do daytime service and we'll put this into a place where we know we already have gaps in service between our peak hours during the daytime. And let's see what it looks like. And unfortunately, as soon as we had this all set up and ready to run, COVID hits and we're all in lockdown and various other things for a few months. So from our perspective, those are the sort of questions that we had in the background. Here's what we weren't worried about. And because I was able to do this for relative inexpensive thing, I wasn't worried about it being a set piece KPI. There's all sorts of things that you have, but what this does lead us into is having a service standard. And for those smaller properties that don't know what I'm talking about, put your hand up and ask for bigger properties about service standards. And if you're a property that has a service standard that's gathering dust in the shelf, maybe this is a good time for you to go and look at it, because that's what we had to do in Saskatoon. We had to basically go back into our file history, steal some information from a couple of other cities and develop service standards. And that's what I'm talking about when I mean, or Arjan was talking about, when you see 20 to 40 passengers per hour on a fixed route service, that can become a set of service standards. And what are your requirements to do microtransit and what are your requirements to do more? So we weren't worried about establishing those or having a on-demand transit meet a set KPI. But what we ended up doing was we started confirming the draft KPIs that we started establishing so we can understand what we're going to. So we weren't worried about it at the start. We're absolutely worried about it as we're working through the process. We didn't know if we were going to get it right from the start. We didn't know if the idea of using it for gaps would work as well as things that worked in Belleville for Belleville Transit, or whether they were going to work as well as the Calgary and the Airdrie experiments or the Innisfil experiment. But we could afford to experiment. We could afford to do things with our system that were out of the box and they were outside of the regular thing that Saskatoon has seen. And then breaking the system. So, in some points along the line, you get invested in certain things and you don't want to break things because you don't necessarily, you're caring too much about it, or you're nursing something along to get to a logical conclusion. Well, with us, because this is so brand new to us, and this is so, okay, we had a couple of set parameters that we thought we would work with, but as we started getting through the pilot, and because COVID had reduced ridership to such an extent, we started talking about, well, let's break the system, try and do something challenging, try and stretch the ridership numbers. And then we started talking with some of our community partners, and we were saying, well, we want to see what it does and we'll see if we can break the system. Unfortunately, we used that language in the middle of a conversation and somebody went, challenge accepted. But it didn't turn out to be bad. It turned out to be quite nice, actually. And it's one of those things that leads to a little bit of success for us in this. What happened are quick lessons learned. Customer expectations are tricky. They expect other things like what the slide says. So when you think you've got everything set, you start getting complaints about what you don't have in this system. And that's normal customer service. But, you know, do you have an API that hooks into the transit app or your other kinds of apps? Do you have a taxi app so that instead of going from an on-demand transit app to the transit app to a taxi app, does your app connect via API so that you've got one sort of app to rule them all, or one app that gives you, I go on this app and I can get both sets of trips, so I can do a full set of planning from start to finish. So if I'm at a hockey game or a football game and I'm taking the commuter shuttle that gets me from the full parking lot out, so I'm avoiding the traffic jam that's on the road, can I use that app because I'm on a commuter bus? Can I use that app to book a cab to pick me up at the downtown terminal where the bus stops? Or can I use this to also look at which bus do I take? Or if it's really late and I'm only running shuttle service from the main center of town to one of the transit centers, can I do the shuttle from the rink to the downtown terminal, take a regular service bus to go out to the next transit terminal, and then catch the cab or get a bike, an e-scooter or whatever? It's one of those things where people want more connectivity, and that's the sort of thing that you have to understand. Starting small really works. It allows you to have a small team of folks, 2 or 3, that learn this inside out and start understanding how it's going to affect things. And then you start applying it to the broader system, and you've got these focal points, these sources of experience, these subject matter experts that provide you with information that you can use to go forward. And then there is a group of the willing. There's a bunch of other folks in transit systems across the country right now that are experiencing this. They're at various different levels of experience with their on-demand transit pilot. So you get to build that coalition of the willing to explore, willing to share information. And it really doesn't matter which vendor they're using. Some of us talk about what vendor we're using and relate the stories, and well, no, you had to do this and that, and that's great. But sometimes it's just the concept between properties, and you can say, okay, well, watch out for this, watch out for that. There's lessons that we each learned differently that we ship back to each other, and we ended up understanding what it was about. And one of the biggest lessons that I think all of us on-demand transit, micro-transit properties learned was that having an operator that understands the system and what it actually means is worth its weight in gold. And for those of you that want to put this out on the extra board, or you want to use it as a spare run or something like that, please refrain from doing that. And it's not just an hour-long conversation. Really, the concept of having this work well is really good when you've got an operator that's going to be on that route that understands your microtransit system and what it enables your customers to do. That is worth its weight in gold. And if you can find a couple of those folks, that's great. That's the exact thing you should be doing. This is sort of the things that we ended up doing. Here's some of the stats that we ended up seeing. And this was once we ended up breaking open the system. And this is about the start of June to date, to about the end of last week, I think it is. We opened up the system from our one trial route for our pilot. We've opened up the system to the whole city with 2 particular different kinds of coverage areas and zones. And this is the sort of thing that we've been seeing, and we're quite happy with what those numbers are at this point in time. These are some of our on-demand transit, the folks that are the Instagram influencers that we have that are riding around on our system. I know this is a teaser, and I know there's a lot of other things that are being probably pushed around in the chat. I'm going to end my presentation at this point, and I'm going to turn it back to Simon so we can get some good questions and some conversation flowing. Simon, back over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jim. And yeah, that was great. It was great to see the numbers at the end and something very real and practical. So I appreciate that. I'll invite Arjan back. We're gonna do some questions. And And I'll just invite anybody else who has any more questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A portion. We'll keep checking them as we go on. I'll just wait. You guys can both. Why don't we do all the videos, and then we'll just have a chat if you guys are okay coming back on. Great. Sorry about that. I probably confused everything.
Just give me a minute, son. I'll pop back up when I've gotten back to my notes.
Okay. No problem. No problem at all. And Arjan, then I'll start with you with a question. I'll start with the one. There's one I see that came in for you about defining that the passengers per hour. So I think someone's just kind of questioning that 10 to 20 passengers per vehicle hour and saying, is that where did you get that number? Maybe give some of your experience as to why you think that's kind of the sweet spot in there.
Yeah, maybe it can be also at a lower period of time. I just looked at it also from an economic point of view, saying like what makes sense. I think the number goes lower also if it's like a policy priority. For example, if you want to have like want to still have vehicles going from the one place to the other, and you want to have vehicles, for example, 100% accessible, it makes sense that you have those vehicles going. I don't know all the details about what Moya does in Hamburg. I've seen them also active in Berlin. But I think in general for microtransit is, yes, I think the capacity, making 10 to 20 people per hour is very challenging, because if like accessible services typically operate only at 2 people per hour. So with an on-demand going from 2 for people with disabilities to going to 10 is probably even challenging. So, but I think there it comes also in that if the policy goals are to make sure that you want to have more accessible fleet, that you have your own branded vehicles, that capacity and that number of people per vehicle hour goes down. I just want to make the point that then there's also a possibility to evaluate like what they're doing at YRT, what they're doing at EXO, for example, to say like there is a possibility you work with the Ubers, the Lyfts, the taxi companies, say like, because if a vehicle hour cost is, for example, $80 and you have only 10 people per hour, it's $8 per trip. And we're now focusing a lot also on making an economic viable model for the future. I think it's something to consider at least. And if you know that your capacity is going to be lower, you also know that you are providing a more costly service, which can be totally fine, right? And in my slides in the backup, I have actually an example. We did an analysis together with another company called Immense, and they had a simulation and we evaluated, for example, what you could do in a specific area. And we took some data from Quebec City, and we said like, okay, you can either serve your demand with 3 vehicles that are fully accessible, or you can do the same demand or actually double the demand for the same cost with 1 accessible vehicle complemented by taxi or something else, or you can even do triple or quadruple the demand served with the same budget, but you don't have an accessible service if you just use sedans, for example. So then it really becomes a policy choice, and you see the same choices are being made in Innisfil on the one extreme. They're saying like, we're choosing to serve as many people as possible in the entire town of Innisfil, where maybe another city like Belleville, they say we want to have fully accessible services to everyone in our town. And that's why we choose those vehicles. So the guideline is just a guideline. And that's also why it's so important to understand why you're providing that service. So hopefully that's a long response, but I think in the end, I would want to say like, there is no wrong answer. It is just, what do you want to do with your services and who do you want to serve? And what is the budget that you have available for the type of service?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, it kind of goes back exactly to what we were saying, is that you need to start with what are your goals? What are your objectives that you're trying to achieve? And there's obviously guidelines and different things out there, but those might change if you choose different objectives or different goals or what you're trying to do. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm going to pick another question that's come in, and I'll go to both of you, but I'll start with Jim, and I'll maybe slightly tweak the question for both of you. For Jim, what did you find was the kind of ideal size for the service area for your on-demand service? How did you kind of determine that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I want to just jump in and say that I did throw another answer to that question that came in about the TCRP report number 88, which is the performance metrics report from the TCRP. It's a great toolkit. If you're looking for what kind of KPIs should I be using on any part of transit, it covers the entire spectrum. A little dated now, it doesn't have on-demand transit, so those numbers that Arjan brought out were absolutely bang on. But from our perspective, ideal, do you understand the concept of what on-demand transit actually means? Do you understand the concept of microtransit? Because talking about it in a forum like this is great, but if you're sitting there thinking, I have a route that is only peak hour service, but I know there are people that want to use that route, and it's one route in my entire city during the day, and that's the only one that really bugs me. That's big enough to start a pilot. You might want to say, well, how many buses does it take to cover my entire city? That is, it really, there's no ideal answer other than how much are you prepared to experiment? Because this is one of those things where you can actually experiment. Counselors, city politicians, if most of the ones that I've spoken to are absolutely in favor of us going down this path. And even if we come up and say, this is more expensive per trip than regular transit, except for maybe accessible transit, they still go, that's okay, because you're dealing directly with passengers and customers and citizens. So the ideal size is whatever you're willing to spend the money on, is pretty much the answer I'll give.
And I think to that point, the more important factor that you would want to measure is, instead of your maybe cost and ridership, is how many people in your town do you want to provide access to transportation, right? And if you're saying we're good with only 10% being able to use it, then you can keep your system as it is. But if you're saying we would want to have like 80% of the people having access, that's a completely different discussion. And typically the people that don't have high incomes, if you target those, they might not live in a place that is easily accessible anyhow. So you might need to do some additional services for that. So I think, how many people are you targeting, and possibly what is their realistic time to go to their destination, instead of them needing to take a day off because it just takes them half a day to get somewhere, and with on demand it takes them maybe 15 minutes. So I think that is probably more of the discussion than anything else at this time.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of that. I think I first read about this idea of like the kind of competing interests of ridership versus accessibility, which is sometimes competing, sometimes not. And I think it kind of leads into that, is like, how are you balancing those needs, and what are you putting towards each? And this is kind of another tool that helps you do that maybe more effectively than the tools that we've had before. I have another question from the attendees that I'll put to you. Maybe I'll go to Arjan for this one. Asking, does on-demand transit service mean first come, first serve, or can I get bumped around to a later and later time? So I think this is getting at that's one issue, but I think it's getting at maybe a bigger concern about, like, one thing people like about fixed route service is that it's reliable. I know exactly what the schedule is. How do you, maybe I'll even expand the question, like, how do you address fears like this and worries that, like, maybe I won't make my connection, or that how can I rely on it if I don't know exactly when it's going to leave and exactly when it's going to get there, and that kind of thing.
Right. I think the concept behind on demand is that it's typically scheduled in real time. So it can happen, of course, that the trip cannot be served. But I think the goal of the transit provider, and of course the partners with who them work, is like to show what your service reliability is. So maybe one of your parameters, you want to make sure that people know, okay, only 1 out of 100 trips gets denied, for example. Because the goal of all these on-demand systems is not to bump people around. It's to just make sure that people have a ride within the service specifications, as Jim was talking about earlier, is saying like, hey, what is my level of service that is acceptable for this service? Do I have like an acceptable 15 minutes or 30 minutes, or an extra time for travel, for example? Once you have those standards, you can work with your suppliers to get that right supply in place. So I think in the end, it should become just a discussion like with fixed routes. You know, with fixed route that you're going to wait 15 or 20 minutes because there is like a 30-minute or 40-minute headway. The same is with on demand. At a certain time, you know that you have a certain supply and you know that the average wait time is 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes. And I think maybe we're not there yet because that's what the practicing and the testing works with, that Jim was saying. But I think that should be the end goal, right? You want to be responsible and reliable, because as soon as you bump people around, you're losing riders. So yeah, I don't know. But Jim probably has more to this point. So
well, I think it's almost a back end. The question almost talks more about the back end of things than it does about the front end of things. So you can set the parameters, depends on what you're going to do. And for the algorithm to work the best, you can't afford for the trip that once it's set to go to a certain next residence to pick it up. It's maximizing the efficiency of the system. So it's setting itself up to be able to go get to you, and you can change those parameters in your system to sort of say, yeah, if the bus is already going, I'm not accepting a trip for that bus, you'll be on the next bus and that sort of thing. But we've also got people that we're offering up to 15 days, 2 weeks out to book a trip. So we risk blowing our customer service satisfaction ratio right out of the water if we mess those folks around. One of the things, however, so this is, and it depends on how you're setting your thing up. We used our system to actually provide new service in an area that didn't get great service between the morning and the afternoon. And as soon as we started, we ended up having the COVID restrictions, which reduced the number of seats on the bus. So, and it just aligned perfectly with startup of this on-demand transit pilot. So we actually did the opposite. And we sort of said to those people that phoned in and complained about being passed up in the morning because there were no seats left on the buses that went by and they were stuck at the stop, we gave them the cards. We shipped supervisors to those bus stops, handed them cards with the on-demand transit information on it and said, book your trip. And then from that point forward, for the rest of the pilot, we've had some of those people that have booked trips every day using on demand, because for them, it's a more sure way of getting a ride on the bus rather than waiting at the stop for it. So there's all sorts of mechanisms that we can use, but how do you stop them when you've got good service going? How do you then sort of move them off of your on-demand transit back onto regular transit? I think there's features in the one we use, it's called grains features, but there's also features, I'm sure every on-demand platform has a feature where if you're going to get on at a bus stop and the timing that you're looking at is the same time the regular bus is going to be there, you're not going to be able to get that trip. So there's all sorts of things that people are thinking about that from a back end, it's transparent to the customer, or it's not transparent to the customer, it's just non-existent. But all of a sudden you're being told, well, you should get on the 15 as opposed to waiting for an on-demand transit bus.
Thanks. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's all about how you design and how it's run and that kind of thing. But I think both of you touched on an interesting point about it, which is like the kind of outreach or education piece, which is making people feel like it's there and it's reliable and that kind of thing. So, and there's obviously different ways to do it. Jim, you touched on the next question I was going to go to about encouraging people to use fixed route service. So maybe I'll start by putting that to Arjan about how you can encourage people to use fixed route service instead of on demand. You know, obviously, like Jim said, where that's available, yeah. You'd want people using that first.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point, right? I think if you can, you don't want to set up an on-demand service that is overlapping with the bus route. So you don't want to have on-demand routes that are too long, because if you have an on-demand route that is 20 minutes, you need more vehicles and there's just more costly. So I think what we've seen is more efficient is that you have, of course, with your fixed route, you focus as much as possible on being as frequent as possible and just connecting in certain zones to your fixed route service at specific points, and saying like, hey, we have a core And the core really needs to be designed not as a ziggity-zag bus route that covers everything, but goes really from the main place to the other main place to the corridor. And the on-demand transportations are the ones that give people a 5 or 10 minute ride to that corridor with minimum wait time to get to where you want. And I think that is more of the concept than saying we're replacing this entire bus route with on-demand. And because it just makes it more complex, I think designing it in such a way that it is complementary and not competitive is really important. And I think the technology tools, I'm sure from every provider can do this, right? That's exactly what's in our tools and what other providers do in making sure that you connect to those bus services. And even from a pricing point of view, what we see, for example, some providers doing, so if you go to the bus service, your trip is for free. And if you want to go on demand to another location and you go around it, you simply pay more. So then, and people start making that choice as well. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of smart design and using the tools to what they can do. But
I'm going to jump in here because one of the things that we're still talking about, and I think lots of other systems do as well, is if you've got an underperforming route, you're underperforming route, you can't put the right amount of service hours in there because it'll either be too long for people to wait or it's too much money for us to put in there. So with your on-demand, what you do is you're providing as good service to some of those where the ridership numbers may not be as 10 or 20 per hour. You're providing as good a service to that person that's in that neighborhood as a fixed route service would on one of your high performance routes. But as a transit system, are you thinking or are you planning, or is it even open for discussion to cash in some of those non-performing routes, take those service hours and the dollars assigned with it and put those towards your on-demand transit service and just say, I'm not providing this fixed route service on this route anymore, but you're going to get the same or better service than you would have regardless of what fixed route service we went in there. With Microtransit now in our pocket, this is a conversation we can actually be having with citizens and our councillors and those politicians. And it's really exciting to be able to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And you possibly can become more flexible. So when your demand grows, you can, if with all the technology tools that you have, a person doesn't need to know if the bus was a fixed route or an on-demand vehicle in the end. He just will go from A to B. And when you see that the capacity grows, you just make it go more on a fixed route. And I think that flexibility will evolve over time. It's not easy because, of course, equity is always a challenge in that. But I think with the tools that are available these days, that becomes more and more, I think, the norm in the future, that your systems will just simply become more flexible. You just guarantee travel time and instead of like a specific arrival time at a stop.
And it completely changes the flavor of your service with regard to your paratransit service or your specialized or accessible service, because you can absolutely do the same thing across your system if you've got a 100% fleet of accessible buses. The only difference is I have to do a door-to-door trip for that passenger, but I'm still going to meet the delivery parameter for the 2 ambulatory people that are on the bus that got on as an on-demand passenger. Well, we're talking about a completely different way to provide service.
Yeah.
And I think like one of the things that kind of went off in my brain as you guys were talking is like, how much technology is enabling a lot of this and has the ability to put a lot of things that riders historically had to worry about in the background now in the future, right? Like, the potential of having, going somewhere and not having to worry about, like you said, maybe the possible future of like not even worrying about what type of services that, you maybe input your destination and something guides you as to how to get there is really exciting. And I think it speaks to how much, like I said, it's putting all that kind of stuff that, transit riding the bus used to be looking at a timetable and finding the right time and studying a map and all that stuff. And so much of that is going in the background. That's really exciting. So I'm going to jump around a little bit with these questions, just to give different questions, different people. Jim, I'll ask you about how, in your case, people are paying for the services. So, what's the payment mechanism, and are trips subsidized in your case?
So for us, it's a transit trip is a transit trip is a transit trip. There's no subsidization. We're using our resources to do all of this. So the only different cost for me was the cost of the software license and the cost of, well, it's a transfer from one place to the next as to what the bus does. So it's $3 if you're taking if you're using a cash fare in Saskatoon, that's the cost for ODT. We don't have yet an agreement with any of our TNCs other than one of the local cab companies does appear, it has an API with the transit app for Saskatoon. And that I think is a really good thing for them to have done.
And then maybe I'll ask Arjan you kind of this similar questions about what models you've seen used in terms of fare payment.
Yeah, so fare payment, of course, with the TNC model from an Uber point of view, there's different ways that people can pay. If there's microtransit and there's a fare box in the vehicle, people can pay through the fare box, or they can pay cash, or they can use the fare card in the transit vehicle. The other option is in the Uber app, of course, there's a possibility that people can use with their own payment methods. That could be either credit card or bank number, or they can, for example, go to like they can go to the store and basically buy like gift card to up their balance basically, or if they don't have a bank account or anything like this, they can, for example, go to like a CVS here in the US at least, and they show what their Uber name or username is. They give the cashier like $10, and the $10 will be put in their account. So there's different ways of paying these types of services. And of course, the payment then goes to the transit provider, because in this case they just use the Uber software platform, but all the revenues go directly to them basically.
Okay, great. I'll have another one for you, Arjan, about metrics. We talked a little bit about having those metrics that maybe give people the confidence, again, that they won't have interruptions in their rides and stuff like that. So if someone was using Uber or a different provider, would they be able to get those metrics to help provide those?
Yeah, so it depends. It depends on the model. For example, if you arrive at the airport from Toronto and you just take a personal trip to downtown Toronto Union Station on your own, and you pay $20 or whatever it is, you will not see that information as a transit provider. But what we do is we make for Microtransit the whole platform available for the transit providers themselves. And if you operate your own vehicles with your own drivers and you have your own passengers, all that data is just available through a dashboard, and it is also the transit providers information, right? So if Jim operates, let's say Saskatoon Transit, but he would use the Uber platform, and there's people that are going on board of his vehicles, those data for those riders are rides that are basically that are his riders with his information that he has the full access to. And if you're talking about TNC, if people ask like, hey, if this is something like I saw that here in Sweden and Denmark, something in the questions, it depends if you work with Uber for the first and last mile, if these are subsidized rides programs. So basically the transit provider pays for the trip to make the transit trip price, as Jim was saying. Then also that data is available for the transit provider, so they get their dashboard and they can see, okay, where did people travel to and from, at what time, who were the first time riders, who were not. So they can do a lot of analysis with that type of data. And I think that's something that I've seen changed. I mean, I'm only with Uber for a year, but a lot of internal discussions I had with the team internally is to make clear and to help change that data is so important for transit providers. So there's a lot of change that has taken place over the last period of time in giving that ownership and data insights to the transit providers, specifically when they are talking about their own riders, of course.
Great, yeah, thanks. I'll go back to Jim for a question about, I really want to ask both of you, I'll start with Jim about COVID. I have to ask about COVID and how did you find that impacted your plans? And then in addition to that, what I'm also curious about is like, how do you see the way that travel patterns might change post-COVID, and how do you see that potentially impacting your plans for microtransit? So I'm thinking about things like, you know, are there going to be less commuters, you know, during the peak and that type of thing?
So to date, peak service has disappeared.
Yeah.
We and you know, our sweet spots were between 6 and or between 5 and 9 in the morning and between 3 and 6 in the afternoon. Well, that's gone. The ridership has completely disappeared for that. And people are only now starting to go back to their workplaces. But even so, the workplaces are finding that it's hard to get people to come back. However, for us, the start of COVID was one of those things where it was a logistical nightmare for my planner, because we kept our high ridership fixed routes. But what we had to do was, so university was shut down, so we stopped running buses to the university. We took those service hours and we realigned them back into our busiest routes. So we actually had capacity. So we built up the capacity on our buses with reduced number of seats available and no standing loads. So that's what we ended up having to do. And as we're getting ready for the university to come back, we're talking about between 10 and 15,000 students a day going to the university, from a standing start of about 1,000 that we're playing with right now, all happening sometime in September. So we're looking at what we're doing, and for our perspective, we're trying to adjust, and we don't know where these students live either. The great September start off, where last year we know where people went and rented apartments if they're first year university students. This year we have no idea. They could be at the same place, the neighborhood they were last year. They could be in completely different neighborhoods. So we don't know where to put the extra capacity. So having access to an on-demand transit sort of thing, we might be able to use that to help us take care of some of this extra ridership demand in the first couple of months. And the other part of it is that we shortened up our sign up for September to 2 months instead of 5, so we can go back and maybe adjust as required in November. But you know, having an on-demand transit system that is available across the city really does help, and will be helping us when we come back to it in September.
Yeah, you know, that makes sense. I mean, the system's so much more flexible that you can adapt it. You said September, and I keep hearing, you know, when is this coming back? When is that coming back? It always seems to be September, which is like, it kind of makes sense to me from a COVID perspective, but it seems a little bit scary if everything comes back at once, right? How to plan for it, how to manage it. Anyways, Arjan, I'll maybe ask you that same question, but maybe from a more general sense about like looking at anywhere, how those travel patterns could change, and how might people look at microtransit differently because of that.
Yeah, I would just want to tag on to Jim. We're more providing it as a service to the transit providers there, for that matter. But as already said, I think the peak hours will definitely be different than they were before. But I think people will also be coming back, of course, to normal transit at a certain time. But I think the data that you're gathering with your microtransit services are just going to be allowing you to be more flexible in your service provision. And of course, microtransit service is always a lot easier to set up and to define and to adjust. Also, because you're typically talking about smaller vehicles that can more operate in more different places. So I think for that matter, there is more flexibility to operate over the next period of time. And when things are coming back, I think things will be different for sure. I think the other thing that we're seeing is there is more discussion about joint marketing approaches and really targeting specific groups of riders. Let's say, okay, we have a whole group of tourists and they all want to go from Toronto to Niagara Falls. And in the past, they went first to the Ava station and they rented the car, and all the tourists, they took the rental car and went to Niagara Falls. I think what you're seeing now is that the transit providers are also more interested in providing those specific use cases and saying, why do we let those guys take that rental car? And while there is, like say, a Metrolink service available that takes people there in the same amount of time with less hassle. And that's, I think, the benefit, maybe what came out of this, is that they're probably more willingness for cooperation between different parties and addressing specific use cases. And one is, as mentioned, tourists, but there is also business travelers that always took a rental car, I think. But I think if you see the convenience of not having that rental car and the budget that you can save for not having that car on the entire day, I think there's opportunities there. Maybe they're not completely there yet, but I think we'll get there, right? And I think it's so much more convenience for so much different use cases that are more targeted. So I think that's one of the things that I see. The transit agencies in the past, I think they always measured the number of people, but they didn't know if it was Simon, Jim, or Arjan and why he was traveling. And I think the change that you're seeing now is that they want to know, hey, is this Simon, is this Jim, is it Arjan, is he a student, is he a business traveler, is he a tourist? And because of that, we're going to offer him something that he really needs. And I think transit providers already have that experience in-house through their accessible services. But I think now you can see that that is going to be a lot more integrated. So for that matter, I would expect that services are going to be a lot better and targeted in the future. Maybe not tomorrow, because as you say, everything has to happen in September. So doing it all at the same time is hard, right? But I think if we look in a year from now, there will be a lot more opportunities there.
Yeah, I mean, COVID has definitely made that more challenging, right? Like any type of prediction is really hard right now, but that will change with some time as things stabilize a little bit more, I'm sure. I'll ask. I have a few more questions from the attendees. I'll ask about cost savings. So, Jim, you mentioned looking at some of the costs associated with doing this. Do you think there's ways that you can do this and save costs, like make it more cost effective by implementing this?
Is it, so I think, is it saving money or being more efficient so you can put out more service for the same amount of money?
Right.
And I would change that slightly by a different nuance. And it goes right back to that thing I posited about a little while ago, where you've got a gap in service, or you've got service. There's a neighborhood, and we just experienced this. There's a neighborhood that is really not designed well for transit. If I put a transit service into that neighborhood, it would be at the far end of the system, and they would only be a small trunk line, and they would go to a transit center where they would have to catch another bus to get to anywhere else. So I would look at how many of those things do I have, and can I use on-demand in replacement of putting in a fixed route bus route, a fixed route line to that neighborhood? And can I restrict the number of trips that go in and out of that neighborhood to only be on-demand trips? Mm-hmm. And there's a way you can do that with whatever provider you've got. But that is the mechanism by which you save money. You're putting the same money out the door. So I'm not saving any money in terms of overall expenditure, but I am getting more passengers on a bus for the same price, which I think is more efficient. And we're exploring what that means to sort of, like I alluded to earlier, where you cash in either, you're not going to get anybody traveling on that bus between 10 in the morning and 6 or 5 in the afternoon. So why do you have a bus driving around empty? Why can't you cash that in, change that over to, I put more service hours into the on-demand experience? What you have to be very careful about if you're a transit company is whether your union is going to stick their oar in the water on that one or not. Some of the operators absolutely love this kind of service, others absolutely detest it, and you might get a bunch of folks from within your bargaining unit saying, you're not expanding this anymore, are you? And I think as this comes online more and more, we might be experiencing those kinds of conversations with our bargaining units.
Yeah, that makes sense. Arjan, for you, I wanted to ask about combining or about integrating with specialized transit, and how you think that a system could integrate the two.
Yeah, I think it's already happening on a large scale, honestly speaking. I mean, that's not something new. And I think if any transit system does their analysis, I think typically between 70 and 80% of their riders are ambulant riders. But that makes it easier, right? So they don't need necessarily to have like the door-to-door, but they can have also already curb-to-curb service, for example. So what you're seeing, I think what we're seeing as Uber, for example, is that there's a lot of transit agencies that say like, okay, can we just have some of the rides that are really costly for us already outsourced to like a taxi or sedan service that costs, let's say, $20 or $15 instead of 30 or 40. And I think the good example in Canada is Montreal. I think they're able to do their entire service with, I think it's 89 vehicles, and they have an average accessible service cost of like $20, for example, like this, right, or 25. And they have already done this, what you see happening in general in the industry now by combining these types of services, but that is already in place since years. So it's not anything new, but I think these technologies, they allow the transit providers to say like, okay, here, Jim is an accessible rider and he needs to go to the supermarket. I don't necessarily need to send my accessible services to send him, or I can use the accessible services for Simon, who is just a normal rider and he's just waiting, and he can go to the supermarket together with Jim. So there's a lot of opportunities now to bring these things together. And I think you can just more look at the abilities from the rider, not necessarily putting them in a bucket. And I think you see that already in the Uber app. Of course, you see that people can just request a normal vehicle, or they can take transit, or they take an accessible vehicle. Will help, of course, in setting that up, in setting up the pricing for those organizations differently, so that the transit prices, Jim said. But I think that's generally possible with any type of technology, and saying like, hey, these lines, they will blur. And in the end, you just have a service that's more flexible and that is more fit toward the individual rider in general. Right. And so, yeah, I think that is very much so that the combination of those services will take place. I think it depends mostly on the, as Jim also mentioned, how quick are you internally to make that happen? Are you getting your unions aligned? Because some organizations have one union for the specialized and one for the conventional. So those are just practical questions I think you have to work through. But I think from a technical point of view, it's not an issue. And I think that's hopefully that responds to your question there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, in the end, it's about serving people and making sure that they have access to the same services as everyone else, right? So as long as you can do that without dropping the level of service. Jim, I noticed you unmuted. Did you have something you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, this whole conversation is not about the technology, it's about the people. And more importantly, it's about the people that are serving those other ones. And there's a back end of technology, like my back end of my, we use Pass for the booking and scheduling of our paratransit service, and we don't use that for our regular one, and we don't use that for our on-demand service. So it's a question of whether the agency is able to pivot quickly enough so that it can actually lump those things together, so that you've got one standard, or you've got one sort of ability to provide that service. And then it's all about, how do you get everybody on your side singing off the same song sheet? Do they understand what the concept means? Do we have to re-educate people? Because yesterday you were only providing specialized service, and today you're providing on-demand first last mile kinds of service. So, it's just a question of it's a question of how you do your change management with all of this.
Right.
Yeah. Technology is probably the easiest thing. Sorry about that, technology providers, but if the widget works, the widget works. Getting people to use the widget, that's the hard part.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's a lot of different people that you might have to shift or bring together, or look at something differently that it can be hard to do, right? Okay, I think we'll do one more question that I'll ask both of you, and then we can start to wrap things up. Jim, I'll go to you first about when you did your rollout. Was there any surprises or anything that caught you off guard, or maybe that you wish you had known beforehand?
One of the things that I wish we'd done was a little bit more seating with the customers and a little bit more dialogue. It's not that it didn't go well. It's just that there's some other things that we could have done better. I think we could have learned a little bit more as we put it out. It sort of arrived and we jumped, and so as it is with all things, when you don't really understand it, so you're fumbling around in the dark a little bit. We had all of the vendor information, but what does it mean to a person? And that's sort of that sort of thing. The surprises, the positive surprises that we received were, I think it was learning that it's something we didn't expect at all. And when you put your bus route or your on-demand, the way we're doing it, if you put your on-demand in a certain neighborhood, all of a sudden you're getting so much good information about where are those people getting on your bus. More importantly, where are they getting off your bus? So you can actually look at a place and you can then start putting in parameters about, well, is that bus stop ever used by anybody? How many legacy stops? We used to have 4,200 in Saskatoon, I think. Now we're down to 2,300 or something, because we've done a large audit to get rid of bus stops that aren't useful or that we don't need anymore or that people aren't using. When you start tracking this kind of data, and we're not even tracking, and the people's data protection is being maintained. But even so, we're finding out where people are actually using bus stops along a different route and where is the critical mass. So that only helps us as we go further down the road, developing the fixed route idea. This is the corridor. I've got the stats that show me this is where people are using our buses. And then I've got an end destination that now is a lot of on-demand trips are going there. So I need to figure out how do I get there. And that proves the point for me putting a fixed route service in there when I past a certain level of service. So this is awesome. And this is the perfect kind of data we've been looking for, but haven't managed to find it right or haven't managed to dig the questions out of our data tables.
Yeah, that's great. So that's like a positive surprise, is that how much information, useful information, you were going to get out of this. Or yeah. Arjan, I'll ask you something maybe in the same vein, is just maybe what's something that you see that people don't consider or that they don't think about when trying to tackle something or when thinking about microtransit?
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, and also mentioned by Jim, thinking about it right now, but I think the marketing and the outreach is something that is often overseen. It's like, we want to start testing this. Can we start next week? But I think the outreach, and how are you going to outreach, and do you want to have outreach to email or to text or to brochures or flyers or all those kind of things, are not often part of these programs. Of course, I think that's one important thing. And of course, also making sure that you have your drivers aligned and understanding what these services are. It's a different type of service. So with driver, yeah, it is a more personalized service. So you kind of have to make sure that your drivers also understand what the rules of engagement are, because they're different. So I think it's just important. The education point of view is really important, and not to underestimate. Make sure you document it well, because if it just helps. So I think trying to do it quick for an experiment is good. And sometimes people are asking, can you do this with us in 2 months? And everyone has to prove that it can be delivered in 2 months. And yes, technically it's all possible. But I think if you look at how long it takes to schedule a meeting between you and I, then you're already 2 weeks down the road, right? I mean, that's how it is. And so I think it's more realistic to make it like maybe 4 months or 5 to have an initial start of a program. You know, of course, there's emergencies that you need to do things quicker. But I think if you have the time, take the time and make sure that everybody knows what you're talking about. I think that's maybe something that I would suggest, at least, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, you know, any type of transportation option, especially if there's new options, I think it's really important, because people tend to go with just what they're used to, right? Like, people don't want to spend, you know, maybe when we're in the industry, we're different, but most people don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about what their options are, right? They just do what's familiar, and what they know. So if there's a different option out there, they need to be informed about that. Most people probably aren't going to go looking for it, right, themselves.
Yeah, and maybe a different lesson. I mean, in my town, the mayor was really positive about biking, and he translated one of our car streets into a bike lane in his first week. And then people were so against this that we're now 4 years further and it's still not back because of the fact of all the backlash, right? And I think that's maybe the thing, that make sure that you get everyone aligned. There's a lot of participants and stakeholders in this game, and it takes a little while to make people aware of these concepts. But if you do it, make sure you have all the support and education that's in place.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, I think that's a great note to leave it on. So I really want to thank Arjan and Jim for taking the time to speak. I think I'm thrilled with how this went and the discussion we had. It felt very natural. It felt like we had a good discussion. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone also that attended and who were willing to ask questions and contribute. You definitely, that's what we want. We want to answer your questions, so we really appreciate that. There's some contact information on the slide, so if you have further questions for Arjan and Jim, there's the contact information. But with that, then I think we'll wrap things up. Look for some more details about our next webinar in the learning series in likely a couple weeks. You should see details come out for that soon. But yeah, so thank you, Arjan and Jim, and thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you for this organization. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.